Welcome to All Access, where we meet at the intersection of healthcare and generic and biosimilar medications. Brought to you by the Association for Accessible Medicines, representing the generics and biosimilars industry.
Hello, I'm Dan Leonard, and welcome to All Access. Today, our podcast is focused on the Build Back Better legislation and its impact on the generic and biosimilars industry, also known as, at least by me, Build Back Better, Buyer Beware. But we'll get into that and why I say that. We've got three great guests today to discuss this critical legislation and its impact on our industry. First is Karst. Kurt is the director at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. Kurt writes the FDA Law blog. Many of you may be familiar with that. That's a major resource for FDA-related information. Kurt is a well-known, established expert on Hatch-Waxman, has written over 30 articles on the subject. He's also co-authored one of the preeminent textbooks on generic drug approval requirements, and has worked in the generic and biosimilar industry for more than 20 years. So say hello, Kurt.
Hey, Dan. Thank you very much.
And joining Kurt to give us industry perspective, two of our members here at AAM, Rachel Turow is the Associate General Counsel for Regulatory Law and Policy and the head of U.S. Regulatory Policy at Teva Pharmaceuticals. Rachel worked for a number of years at FDA and has been working in policy for over 15 years in a number of different roles. So Rachel Turow, say hello.
Good morning, Dan. Thanks so much for having me.
And then Rachel Goode. Rachel is Senior Vice President for Biosimilars, Patents, and Legal at Fresenius Kabi. She's recently published academic papers on drug pricing and testified, did an excellent job testifying before Congress on generic and biosimilar competition earlier this year. Say hello, Rachel Goode.
Hello, Dan. Thanks for having me here today.
So we are going to focus, as I said, on Build Back Better 2.0 or whatever the inscription is on the current version. And Kurt is going to walk us through the legislation, what's in it, what it would mean for it, what it means really, and then we're going to pivot to Rachel to talk about, frankly, what it means for industry going forward and patients. So let's turn to Kurt. First question, to get the background and the specifics on the legislation. So Medicare price negotiation, Kurt, this is a big part of the legislation, a controversial part of the legislation. Can you describe at a high level, what it means, specifically how it sits inside Build Back Better and the whole component of price negotiation?
So the Build Back Better Act, it directs the Department of Health and Human Services to select certain drugs that will be the subject of price negotiations. And in doing so, HHS, and Department of Health and Human Services, will publish a list of selected drugs and negotiate or renegotiate agreements with manufacturers to set a maximum fair price for such drugs.
Of those specifics or those provisions, why is this such a critically important topic at this time?
It's a matter of timing, as so much is in life, of course. So the Senate right now is considering Build Back Better under some special rules and could potentially pass the legislation on a straight majority as opposed to the typical 60-vote majority.
So every vote counts. 50 Democrats in the Senate, one tiebreaker, and a Democratic vice president. So they need every vote, which is why this is taken, I would say, so long to get to where we are to now. But we're it's still a critical time in the evolution of this law. Again, back to price negotiation. In the law, these provisions in Build Back Better, when would Medicare negotiation commence as written in the bill?
So Dan, it depends if we're talking about a small molecule under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act or macromolecule or biological products under the Public Health Service Act. So for small molecules, we're talking about 7 years, and then price implementation at 9 years. And then biological products, there we're talking 11 years and price implementation at 13 years. So we've got this bifurcated system depending on drugs or biologics.
How many drugs could be subject to negotiation under this proposal?
It's a stepwise system. So we're talking about 10 drugs would be added to the list in 2026, and then 15 in 2027 and 2028. and then up to 20 products ending in 2029.
And so the negotiation process that would be led by the Secretary of HHS, correct?
Correct. So here we'll go. So the HHS Secretary, they can't negotiate a price higher than a ceiling that's 40% to 75% discount, which depends on the length of time the product has been approved without generic or biosimilar competition. So that off the average price paid to the manufacturer by wholesalers or the net price. Now, one of the key features, though, of Build Back Better that is really most concerning is about how the bill would not establish there would be no floor, right, and no judicial review for price setting at all. And in other words, the secretary could potentially move down the negotiated price to 1% for the brand drug, and it would not be reviewable. There's no ability to challenge. It's all within the HHS secretary's discretion.
And how does the Act treat patents and exclusivity rights on any given drug? So would patents or exclusivity affect the eligibility of products that are potentially going to come under negotiation?
You've highlighted another problem with the Build Back Better Act. So the bill doesn't exempt products that are protected by patents or non-patent exclusivities. So if you see a product with, let's say, 2 types of exclusivity, we'll talk about a drug listed in the Orange Book, maybe 5-year new chemical entity exclusivity, to which a period of 5-year generating antibiotic incentives now exclusivity has been added, for example. It could be added to the list while still subject to the exclusivity, that is the brand product. And at the end of the day, that really undermines the exclusivity while also taking away the chance for generic sponsors to compete, because those generic sponsors simply, they can't get approval during the exclusivity period, for example. That is, the market would be wholly driven by negotiations, and there wouldn't be any incentive for generic drug development whatsoever.
Can you describe why it significantly impacts and harms the generic and biosimilar industry? So we'll pivot now to the impacts on our industry, and then we'll bring in Rachel. But at a high level, what do you think are some of the impacts on our industry?
Well, I mean, at base, Dan, what it's doing is it's substituting government price negotiations for competition. It's actually sacrificing competition for price negotiations. And competition is really the reason that the generic drug and the biosimilar industry has such a great foothold in the United States. Talking about generic drugs, 92% of the prescription volume is filled with prescription drugs at just 16% of the cost of the products in America. And generics and biosimilars combined for $338 billion in savings in 2020 alone. The negotiated percentages, in the bill are substantially less. So negotiation occurs at a point in time long before generics and biosimilars can reasonably get onto the market, which again is a significant problem with this bill. That means that generics and biosimilars are entering into a negotiated market that could be a fraction of what was anticipated when those companies initially made the business decision to invest in development of this drug or biological product. And at the end of the day, this is just going to create uncertainty and disincentive for investing in generic and biosimilar products going forward. There's also an enormous amount of unpredictability in the bill. As currently drafted, the Build Back Better Act says that the Secretary has discretion to change the negotiated percentages, as I mentioned a few moments ago, or even potentially negotiate a maximum fair price that is below the cost of manufacturing for the drug. And that's crazy. Without any predictability, generics and biosimilars simply can't make reasonable decisions to invest in lower cost, high quality medicines.
So you've captured a few really key points there as we pivot into talking to Rachel. But I cite those statistics all the time. 92% of the drugs prescribed in this country are for generics, yet we only make up 16% of the overall costs. So there's an old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well,
That is exactly right, Dan. So, I mean, competition, again, as I mentioned before, has always been the best solution to lower prices in healthcare and many other industries.
so let's bring in on stage Rachel Turow and Rachel Goode. Thank you, Kurt. We'll come back to you at the end of the show. But let's get the perspective from our two inside experts at two of our member companies, Teva and Fresenius Kabi. So you both heard Kurt, and now we want to hear what you're all seeing and what your understanding is of the legislation from inside your companies. We'll start with Rachel Turow from Teva. What are some of the policy concerns, Rachel, that you have and that Teva has from both, in your case, both the branded side and the generic side of your businesses as it pertains to Build Back Better?
Thanks, Dan, for the opportunity to be here this morning. The policy concerns, I think, are very similar on the brand and generic side, which is usually a sign that the legislation is not going to achieve its intended result. I think Kurt put it exactly right, that introducing uncertainty into the pricing dynamic around branded drugs leads to a challenge in developing a business case for a generic. And the way that the price negotiation is set up in the Build Back Better Act, there is really no way to predict which drugs the secretary is going to put on the list for negotiation every year. And generics and biosimilars are planned for development many, many, many years in advance. And I think there are a lot of missing pieces to the way that the policy was developed, but that is a huge one, is that the industry relies on predictability. Both the brand and generic industries do. And if you look at it from a brand perspective, knowing when generic competition or biosimilar competition may enter the market helps develop a business case for launch for a brand. And knowing what the NPV is of the generic or biosimilar helps to develop the business case for the generic and biosimilar. All of this creates competition in the marketplace. The predictability is crucial, and taking that out of the equation is a disincentive to develop products generally.
Tell us a little bit about complex generics, and then where they would fit in the BBB proposal.
So a complex generic is, according to FDA, a drug with a complex active ingredient, a complex formulation, complex route of delivery, dosage form, a kind of drug device combination product, anything that is beyond a basic small molecule. The problem, as we see it, especially with complex generics, is you're looking at development timelines that are very long. You're looking at an exceedingly long FDA approval timeline. Some timelines for FDA approval for complex generics can exceed 10 years. And so when you combine these two things together, you are essentially creating a negative business case for launch for these products.
Conceivably, you could have the negotiation on a complex product starting well before any approval could even be ascertained by the company.
Oh, absolutely. And in all of these cases, I think that the negotiation is going to take place well before approval, which means that there really will be almost no chance for a generic to enter the market at a profitable price. And I know that's kind of a dirty word when you're talking about drug pricing, but when you look at the savings that competition from generics have earned over the past 20 years, the savings from just basic generic competition and for biosimilar competition are significantly greater than the savings that Medicare is going to achieve through price negotiation. I mean, the absolute best cost savings measure that Congress has ever enacted is the Hatch-Waxman Act. And Congress should take that win. It's as you said before, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like what you said. Take that win. It's we're talking trillions of dollars in savings over the last decade. Name me another government initiative or program that has saved. I can name plenty that cost trillions, but not any that save trillions. So let's talk about access and what this might mean for patient access to complex generics. should this legislation be signed into law?
Well, I think it's a very simple answer, which is there will be less generic competition for complex products. And there are two reasons for this. And there will be less generic competition for all products. So the reason for that is that complex generics are one of the most important drivers of innovation on the generic side. And the financial incentive for developing a complex generic also covers the ability for companies to provide smaller molecule generics that may not be as profitable anymore. And so what you will see happen over time is if there is less of a business case to develop a complex generic, people will be exiting the market both from developing complex generics and from bringing those smaller molecule generics that patients really rely on to the market, especially because those smaller molecule generics often are really not profitable at all, but they're available for patients because of a public health need and because it's the right thing to do. But eventually, without any ability to have a positive business case for the complex products, you will see downstream effects for all generics and significantly less patient access, which is really a tragedy.
And I think the case is true in all of the products we're talking about: small molecule, complex, biosimilars. More actors in that therapeutic area, more products available to patients, more generics and biosimilars leads to more competition, which is the recipe to get prices down for patients. And through the direct negotiation model as proposed, we will see fewer competitors, and long term, that would mean reduced savings to patients.
Absolutely.
So let's pivot now.
I just wanted to,
yeah, please.
Could I just add one more thing, which is the other thing we have to think about is that, and I think Rachel G is going to talk a lot about this as well in the context of biosimilars, but there has to be an incentive to challenge patents for complex generics. Those are the products that are most likely to be subject to a paragraph 4 certification, and the patent challenges for those products bring those products to market many, many, many years before the last patent expiry. And without that incentive, that is never going to happen.
So you teed it up well for Rachel G. Rachel, good, welcome. And let's turn our focus to biosimilars. Of course, biosimilar savings alone in 2020 were $8 billion, which is great, but we're really just at the beginning. It's still a relatively nascent field, and the expected savings for biosimilars are massive. We're talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars, but this could throw ice water on the growth of this new industry. So Rachel, from your perspective, hearing Kurt and now Rachel Turow, what are some of the biggest flaws as you see it at Fresenius Kabi, particularly as it relates to biosimilars?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, if this policy is implemented, you will see fewer low-cost biosimilars being developed. And that means there will be less competition and longer monopolies held by branded biological companies. And biological drugs are some of the most expensive medicines available today. So this policy has the effect of undermining what lawmakers have done by creating Hatch-Waxman for generics, by creating the BPCIA process for biosimilars. And this policy also stifles US innovation into new drugs. So from Fresenius's perspective, Congress could address high drug pricing issues by examining the root cause of the issue. And from Fresenius's view, one of those root causes is the patent system problem, especially for biosimilars.
It sounds like this might be a case of the Congress looking under the wrong rock for the problem. And if there are fewer low-cost biosimilars, and we touched on this a little earlier, but if there are fewer low-cost products available, what does that mean? What's the end result of that? Who pays more?
Yeah, that's the problem. If there are fewer low-cost biosimilars, then patients will ultimately be paying the higher prices for the branded drugs. So this is really going to hurt patients.
We've talked earlier, particularly with Kurt, about the timeline: 7 years for the beginning of negotiation to 9 years for implementation on small molecule. It pushes it out to 13 years for biosimilars, perhaps in an attempted nod at the complex process in developing biosimilars, but it's 13 years even, even a realistic number or a realistic timeline for biosimilars?
So actually, it will be rare that biosimilars can enter the market 13 years from when the branded drug received its FDA approval, because patent term extensions go out for 14 years from this date. So patent term extensions provide for when the primary patent on the drug expires, so the product patent. So this is the strongest patent in the drug portfolio, and it goes out to year 14. So that's the earliest date that biosimilars are typically targeting for their launch. And even more than that, so then after that patent, secondary patents on the drug expire later. And so often these secondary patents delay biosimilar launch even beyond year 14. And secondary patents are those that they relate to, for example, ways of making the drug, formulating it, new methods of treatment, for example. And so public data shows that the fastest biosimilar to ever get onto market until now launched at year 15 from when the branded biologic had its FDA approval. So the most effective way to lower drug prices is generic and biosimilar launches. However, if the government sets the price year for negotiation at 13, then there will be very little incentive to develop a biosimilar.
So, and this gets back to the decisions that your companies need to make. They need to make them very early, well ahead of these years that we're talking about. But if that incentive is either uncertain or is expected to not be there, what will that mean for the decisions that your company has to make and for patients?
Yeah, you're right. So, I mean, it's well known that it takes around 8 years to develop a biosimilar. So our companies are making these decisions 8 to 10 years before this price negotiation would happen. And ultimately, it means that patients will have less access to lower cost medicines, and they will have to shoulder more of the cost of the branded drugs.
So 8 years to develop, but also there's a lot of money spent in there too. The numbers that we use at AAM, just as an average, are about $250 million to bring a biosimilar to market. So, the companies are going to have to make those business decisions to spend that money, not knowing what the future is going to hold for that particular product, correct?
That's exactly correct. And that's why we expect to see less biosimilars being developed.
Let's bring Kurt back in if we can. Kurt, are you there?
I'm here.
All right, so we've got now Kurt, Rachel, and Rachel. So let's wrap it up with an exit question. So one question for all three of you, just to get your individual takes as we wrap up this very important and timely show today. What are your top concerns? Top three concerns about Build Back Better and its impact on patient access to affordable medicines. Let's start with Kurt, and then we'll move on. So, Kurt, what are your top concerns?
My top three from the very long list here. Well, again, I'm going to repeat this current version of Build Back Better sacrifices competition at the altar of price negotiations. 2, it ignores realities of generic drug competition and development, as Rachel has talked about, Rachel Turow, to a large extent. And 3, it also ignores the realities, the patent and exclusivity landscape that surround these products. It's just not a good thing, and it is not going to lead to better patient care.
Okay, Rachel, good. Same question. What are your top concerns about Build Back Better?
Well, so when legislators do not address the root cause of high drug prices and problems, but they're only treating the symptoms, they're creating unintended consequences that can harm patients and the people and the families who rely on our industries. So treating root causes will be far more effective and more beneficial for patients.
I think that captures it well, the unintended consequences portion, which we've talked about earlier. Rachel Turow, same question for you.
I think Kurt summed it up really well, but just to add on, this policy will really result in less innovation and less access to all medicines for patients, branded, generic, and biosimilar. It will decrease competition, and it will fundamentally change the way that patients access drugs in the United States in a negative way. And it cannot be understated the really deleterious effect that this policy will have on a system that is otherwise working.
All right. Well, we've come to the wrap on our program. I'd like to thank Karst, Rachel Goode, and Rachel Turow. Conclusion: unintended consequences have consequences, and we need to be aware of that. And it's now that it is that indeed the time that you to exercise your constitutional right to petition your government. So for all of those in our industry or anyone watching the program today or listening to the program today, go ahead and do just that. Petition your government. Call your members of Congress, your lawmakers, send notes and letters and emails, and let them know what you believe about the current version of Build Back Better. Let your voice be heard. Because patients, at the end of the day, could really be harmed by the passage of this legislation and paying more money over the long run as competition dissolves in the marketplace. So it's time to take action. So thank you very much for tuning in to All Access, and we'll see you next time.